Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and today I'm going to be taking a look into the past. Today I'm going to talk about a comic that got me into Marvel Comics, The Ultimates. Now, I'm going to talk about The Ultimates Volumes 1 and 2 because I feel like they tell one big story. Oh, and before I go any further, I feel like I have to point this out, even if it is the most obvious thing in the world. If you love the Avengers movies, if you adore the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then you have to thank Mark Millar, because so much of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is lifted straight from the pages of the Ultimates. Nick Fury being Samuel L. Jackson, Ultimates. S.H.I.E.L.D. assembling the Avengers, Ultimates. S.H.I.E.L.D. being infiltrated by an enemy that takes over the United States of America, Ultimates. The Chitauri invading Earth, Ultimates. Hawkeye being a family man, Ultimates. The Hulk being a failed attempt at recreating Project Rebirth, Ultimates. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver Twincest, Ultimates. And for God's sakes, Tony Stark in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is basically Ultimate Tony Stark but aged up 10 to 15 years. But yeah, I think I've made my point on that. But getting back to the comic, let's talk about the characters and their characterizations. Starting off with Captain America, I actually really dig this version of Captain America, and I dig it because he feels the most real. Not to say that I dislike 616 Captain America or the movie Captain America, because I really like them as well, but this version of Cap feels like a regular guy from the 1940s. He feels like a dude who just wanted to make the world a better place. And now he's stuck in this weird future where everything's different. The people are different, the politics are different, the culture's different, and everybody he knows except for his best friend Bucky, who grew up and married his fiancée, is dead. And Cap reacts to this just about as well as any man would. And I'm not saying that he's not a righteous man, because he is, but he's also a bit more harsh in the Ultimate Universe than he is in the main universe. But it doesn't feel out of place or weird at all. It feels very natural, and I really like the way Mark Millar handled it. Next we have Thor. Now, I really thought what Mark Millar did with Thor was brilliant. So, in the Ultimate Universe, Odin sent Thor to Earth to be a messiah. Only problem with that is, nobody believes him. And they all think that Thor is just some hyper-liberal schizophrenic hippie with a power suit and an EMP hammer. And this is all further played up in Ultimates Volume 2, and that book focuses on Thor and his mission a little more. And it's easily the most interesting thing I've seen anyone do with Thor ever, and nothing has topped it since. I also really love Thor's costume design and the design of Mjolnir here. This is easily my favorite design for Thor, and I'm kinda sad it's died out and nobody's used it since the end of the Ultimate Universe. I also really love Thor's personality in the Ultimate Universe. There's a scene in Volume 2 where Captain America approaches Thor at one of his parties, and Thor's followers start to throw beer on Cap and spit in his face, and Thor, while he just had a very bitter argument with Steve, stands up for him, and he wipes the beer and spit off his face and his clothes, and I feel like that says a lot about Thor's character in the Ultimate Universe. Then we have Tony Stark, who, as I pointed out earlier, is basically Tony Stark from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or, much rather the other way around, since he was based on the comics interpretation of the character, which I like in small doses. I really think that Marvel Cinematic Universe Tony shines when he's playing off other characters, opposed to when he's doing his own solo adventure. However, the main difference between MCU Tony and Ultimate Tony is that I kinda care for Ultimate Tony a lot more, and that's because Ultimate Tony is far more human than MCU Tony. He has limitations, he has breaking points, and I always kind of thought that that was interesting. There's even a scene during the Chitauri invasion where he pukes in his helmet and he starts to have a mental breakdown because he feels like all this hero stuff is too much for him to handle. Ultimate Tony Stark is drastically different than any other version of Tony Stark I've seen in comics. This Tony operates like that of a NASA operation or a drag race team. He needs a pit crew. His suit requires batteries. Also, this is a world where people have always known that Tony Stark was Iron Man. They skip over the whole Iron Man is Tony Stark's bodyguard thing completely. Another thing to note is that Tony doesn't have an electromagnet or an arc reactor in his chest. He's not doing this whole Iron Man thing to right any of the wrongs that his company has done or whatever. He's just being a hero because he has terminal cancer, and he wants to die knowing that when people think of his name, they don't just think of a guy who was a womanizing skis bag, who was a billionaire, who had more money than he knew what to do with. He wants to be remembered as a guy who did his best to help the world. And honestly, I find that more heroic than any other version of Tony Stark that I've seen, and that makes him more endearing to me. Next we have Giant Man and the Wasp, who in this comic are twisted parodies of what they were in the late 60s and early 70s. They're a couple in a toxic relationship, and he's always beating on her, and she's always crying, but then she always ends up running back to him. And the really sad part is, people try to get involved, but both Hank and Janet refuse to get help because, in a weird way, they love the fighting, they love the arguments, and they feel like that's healthy for them. And the really disturbing part about that relationship is how real it is. And seeing it play out is very disturbing to say the least. Then there's Hawkeye. So I think it's safe to say that this is easily the most badass Hawkeye's ever been. Like, ever. Basically, imagine Marvel Cinematic Universe Hawkeye, except 1,000 times more badass. There's a scene in Volume 2 where Hawkeye does something, and it is magnificent. And if you've read the book, you know exactly what scene I'm talking about. And if you haven't read the book, you will know it when you see it. It will make your jaw drop, and in that moment, you'll think it's the most savage thing you've seen in a comic from the big two. God damn it, dude. Ultimate Hawkeye is metal as fuck, and I'm just gonna end it there and say that this book made me love Hawkeye. Next we have Black Widow. Now, as I've mentioned on the channel before, I'm not the biggest Black Widow fan. I don't really care for her in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think she's alright in the comics. The only places she's really shined for me is Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes and Iron Man 2, but aside from those two places, I haven't really found her to be all that interesting. However, this is the exception, because Mark Millar does something really interesting with her character, and I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read the comic yet, but it's really cool, and I feel like Millar did an amazing job of capitalizing on Black Widow's past as a secret agent. Then we have the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, who unfortunately don't really show up all too often, and there is a story reason for it, and Mark Millar does set up this running gag in Volume 1, and it's a joke that's paid off in Volume 2, and admittedly, it is pretty spectacular. It serves as one of my favorite Quicksilver moments of all time. Scarlet Witch is cool too, but she doesn't really have that much to do. She only really has 2 or 3 standout moments in both volumes, and they're all really cool, and I gotta say, I love how they explain Wanda's powers in this universe. And that's not to say that they don't explain it in the Ultimate X-Men book, because they do, but they go more in depth in it here. She can manipulate reality through mathematical probability, so basically she sees the universe as a very complex yet very malleable equation, one that she can manipulate whenever she feels fit. And now, with all that said, let's address the elephant in the room. These two share a very twin-sexual relationship, and the Ultimates try not to comment on it, but everybody else does, and it's hilarious. But then we get to the end of the book, which hints at Wanda's mechanophilia and her attraction to Ultron and Vision, and that was actually pretty hilarious. Next up, there's Nick Fury. He's basically Nick Fury from the movies, so yeah, there's nothing more to add on that. Then there's the Hulk. This is easily my favorite interpretation of the Hulk. So back in high school, my English teacher explained Sigmund Freud's theory of the id, the ego, and the superego. And the way that she explained it was, the id is our basic primal state of mind. It's our most raw desires and impulses. Meanwhile, the ego is the part of our personality that tries to please the id in a very realistic and socially acceptable fashion. But then we have the superego. Now, this is the part of our personality that strives to be socially acceptable and live up to everything society says we have to. So, the way I saw it was, Bruce Banner has no ego, because all he wants to do is please others around him. But when he turns into the Hulk, his superego disappears and the id comes to the surface, revealing his deepest, darkest desires, no matter how grotesque and vile they are. But it's really interesting, and again, this is just another character who I feel has been made far more interesting under Mark Millar's care. And finally, we have Betty Ross. Now, Betty Ross in this book is atrocious. She is a terrible excuse for a human being, and she's a vile, repugnant woman who I hated. But that's also the point. Betty Ross is cold and calculating, and she's just this fame-seeking, shallow attention whore, and she treats Bruce Banner like total shit. And I loved how in Volume 2 he calls her out on her bullshit, and he calls her out for the worthless pile of shit that she truly is, but in that same turn, he feels like an even bigger pile of shit for being in love with her, And there's a really interesting argument that can be made that in many ways, she's even more of a monster than the Hulk is. Now with all that character stuff out of the way, let's talk about the story. So, Volume 1 is split up into two parts, with the first part of the story basically being a satire of the United States government's reaction, or in Mark Millar's opinion, grossly expensive overreaction to 9/11. So in the Ultimate Universe, Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants attacked New York City, and President George W. Bush um, George W. Bush has S.H.I.E.L.D. put together a team of superhumans called the Ultimates, a team that will respond to superhuman threats. The only problem with that is there are no weapons of mass destruction. I mean, there are no superhuman threats. I'm trying to be serious here, you gotta believe me, but it's just really difficult. Anyways, after a while, it looks like the United States government has just poured billions of dollars into a fruitless endeavor. That is until Bruce decides that the best way to make the Ultimates look like true superheroes and not just a waste of American taxpayer dollars is to Hulk out and give the Ultimates an enemy to fight, which they do, and it's glorious. But then we get to part 2, which introduces the real threat. The Chitauri invade Earth and the Ultimates have to defeat them, and spoiler alert, they do. But then we get to Volume 2, which is more of a complete story. So the other countries hate America. Well, more so than they do already. And the American government starts using the Ultimates as a strike team against other nations. And once the other countries get sick of it, they build an Ultimates team of their own called the Liberators. And basically the Liberators are a perversion of the Ultimates. And they launch this huge invasion on the United States, and it's revealed that this whole plot has been planned for years by one supervillain. And it's a great reveal, one that I'm not going to spoil here, but it's really cool. But in the end, the Ultimates defeat the bad guys, but this time the book ends with Captain America thinking that the Ultimates should operate privately, free from any governmental rule. And that's it. That's how Mark Millar's story ends. And finally we have the art, which is done by Bryan Hitch, which is breathtaking, by the way. So, no duh, because it's Bryan Hitch. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the Ultimates Volumes 1 and 2. I love this comic, and the only real negative that I can throw at it is something that's kind of inherent with Marvel Comics. Marvel likes to stay current, although the only problem with that is current will not be relevant in the next 5 years. But all that said, Ultimates and Ultimates 2 are easily the best thing I've read from Marvel, with the X-Men God Loves Man Kills coming in at a close second, and Spider-Man One More Day coming in at a close third. I'm sorry, I couldn't hold that one to myself. But yeah, this comic is excellent, and I find it really hard to believe that this was written by the same guy who wrote that overhyped pile of trash Civil War, because Ultimates is, well, actually really goddamn good. And the only positive thing I can really say about Civil War is, it gave birth to a great movie? Anyways, I highly recommend the Ultimates Volumes 1 and 2, and I highly recommend that you pick it up, especially if you're a fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Anyways, guys, that is it. I am the Mystical Green Beanie. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios, nachos.